To have Abdu here with us. So as you guys know, tonight is Delusional and Dangerous. It is a night to question Christianity. So tonight's conversation will cover a range of topics, many of which you may feel very strongly about. So you are free to disagree, of course, but we do ask that you are respectful, don't be disrespectful, and please don't be rude. If we do have anyone that is disrespectful, we will politely ask you guys to exit. Other than that, this event is sponsored by Crew, so we are a on-campus Christian organization run by students here at FIT, and our goal is to help students thrive personally, spiritually, and academically. Other than that, I would now like to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Abdu Murray. So if we can give him a round of applause. So just a quick little intro about Abdu. He is a speaker, author, and attorney who specializes in addressing issues where religious faith and emerging cultural trends intersect and collide. He has spent decades analyzing how the major religious and non-religious thought traditions have attempted to address emerging cultural issues. He has also written 4 books, including Saving Truth, Grand Central Question, Apocalypse Letter, and his most recent book, More Than a White Man's Religion, Why the Gospel is Not Merely White, Male-Centered, or Just for Religion. Mr. Murray has tackled complex issues in Q&A forums and debates at leading universities such as Yale, Berkeley, University of Michigan, and the University of Florida. Mr. Murray hosts a podcast and YouTube show called All Rise. He also has a BA in psychology from the University of Michigan and the University of Florida. And he's earned his Juris Doctor from the University of Michigan Law School. Quite impressive. As an attorney, he was named to the Best Lawyers in America and to Michigan Super Lawyers 3 times. So let's all please give Mr. Abdu Murray another warm welcome and applause.
I think that the microphone is on. Is that right? Are you hearing my actual voice or the amplified version of my voice? Not much of the microphone, eh? Let's see. Did I turn this thing on? It's on. Give it a second here. Let's see what happens here. Because it was working when I was down there. So let's see. Is it ready? I very much would like to have the lapel mic because I'm a hand talker. I'm Lebanese guy, so I do this a lot when I talk. I gesticulate wildly because I'm Mediterranean, and that's what we do. We tend to talk with our hands. I feel like I have my hands tied behind my back. So no go in the microphone? All right, I have to figure something else out. Good luck, you got this one. Okay. So is that any better? Is that any better? There we go. All right. Okay. Here we go. So, as I said before, and maybe you didn't hear me say it, but I'm a hand talker, and so this sort of requires me to actually keep my hand steady, which means that I'm going to have a very hard time. It feels like I'm doing my job with one hand tied in front of my back when I do this, so please pardon me if I drop the mic a little bit or whatever it might be. And if I do that, if you can't hear me, you should gesticulate wildly and move your hands about and show me that maybe I should speak up louder. So we're talking about a pretty heavy subject today. It's a heady thing, and it can be a lot of emotion involved in this kind of a thing. Delusional and dangerous. We're here to question Christianity, and some of the big questions now, in terms of what the culture is asking and what's going on in the hearts and minds of a lot of people, isn't just, is Christianity true, or is it merely just this delusion, a delusion of our minds, like most theistic beliefs might be? But it is also dangerous. Is it bad for society? So this is a heady topic, so I thought I'd open up a little bit light to give an illustration that I think helps to move the story along here, but is a little bit on the lighter side. So there's a story of this guy, and he's walking down the road, down the street actually, in a downtown area, and he comes across a travel agency. This is back when we actually had travel agencies. And there's a sign in the window of the travel agency. It says, River Cruise, $100. He's like, That's amazing. In this day and age, there's a river cruise for $100? I gotta go see more about this. So he walks into the travel agency, he walks up to the counter and he says, is that sign for real? Is this really a river cruise for $100? You gotta be kidding me. Like, no, it's really a river cruise, $100, absolutely. The guy says, well, sign me up. He opens up his wallet, takes a $100 bill out, puts it on the counter and slides it over. And someone from behind him clubs him over the head, bonk, he's unconscious. Later on, he finds himself rubbing his head as he comes to in a barrel floating down a river. And he looks over and he sees another dude in a barrel rubbing his head. And he's floating down the river. And he says, hey, do they serve lunch on this cruise? And the other guy says, well, they didn't last year. Okay, never tell that joke again. The idea here is that the second guy was delusional. He has done this before. He's been a victim of the same scam before, but he fell for it again and again. And so, oftentimes people think of Christianity similarly to that Christians go to the well, as it were. They go to the counter and they put their money on the table only to be disappointed again and again, but because they want it to be true so bad, they're willing to believe something even if it's delusional. In fact, it was Richard Dawkins, one of the world's most famous atheists, and probably the most popular book on atheism in history. In his book, The God Delusion, he says this: a delusion is a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence, especially as a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. God is a delusion, and a pernicious delusion. When one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from it, it's called religion. Now, that's a tough statement. No one could ever accuse Dr. Dawkins of not trying to make his point rhetorically persuasively. That's something else. So there's the idea that it's a delusion, but there's also this persistent idea now that Christianity specifically, religion generally, but Christianity specifically, is not only delusional, but it's also quite dangerous for society. It's bad. It's to blame for almost all the social ills we see in our day today. You know, years ago there was a debate between two guys who really know how to do the debate, two pretty smart guys. One was Professor Jonathan Glover out of Oxford University, and the other was Dennis Prager, who's a conservative commentator on the radio, and he knows how to rhetorically handle himself as well. And I believe the debate was about religion. Is religion good for the world? And as a debater, I can tell you, debates are often won in the crossfires when you ask your opponent a question to test their worldview, to test their claims during the course of the opening statement. And so during this debate, again, the issue was, is religion good for the world? Mr. Prager asked Dr. Glover the question. He said, let me give you a hypothetical thought experiment. Suppose you're driving in some area of town and it's unfamiliar to you, and it's dark out and it's raining, and you're driving your car and your car begins to break down and you're far from home. As your car begins to break down, you also notice that your cell phone has died. Now, he didn't use the cell phone part. This is an illustration he used decades ago, so there was no cell phones. But I'm going to add that part in. So your car's breaking down. You're in the middle of nowhere. It's raining dark, and it's raining and it's dark, and it's a dangerous area of town as far as you've heard, and your cell phone has just died. You have no way to contact anybody you know. So your only choice is to get out of the car and go into a home, up to a home and see if they'll help you. But you don't know if it's a safe place, and they don't know if you're a safe person. So you're terrified in the middle of all this. And in the middle of all the rain, of all the darkness, and all the panic, you see a light come on 4 houses down. And 4 strongly built young men come out onto the porch, and it's midnight, and you don't know what they're doing outside, and they see you. And one of them nudges to his friend and points right at you, and they begin to walk towards you, and you know they're coming for you in this dark, unsafe, unfamiliar area. And as you turn the starter over, and it goes click, 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 trying to do something, and the car is almost as panicked as you are. That we can't get going here. As they approach you, Professor Glover, would it matter to you if you found out they had just left the Bible study? The point here is the idea. Back then, it was, would it have mattered to you? Because if you found that out, you would have felt maybe safer, they don't want to come after you, they want to be helpful. You know, it's interesting to me, because if I were to use that analogy now, if I was to debate now, and I've done plenty of debates, if I were to use that debate now, I don't think I would use that question. Here's why, because if my opponent is clever, he'd say, oh yes, it would matter to me tremendously. It would matter to me a lot if I was black, a woman, trans, or gay. I would be terrified if I found that out. Whether that's fair or not isn't the point. The point is that is actually perception, that it's dangerous, that it's cause for so much in the world. In fact, it was Victor Stenger who's quoted as saying, I don't know if he's the one who actually said it, but it's a pithy thing and it sits on the back of a bumper sticker, you know. It says, science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings. Another tough one. So the question now is that a fair assessment? What I hope to sustain for you, and I'm going to try to do this in two parts, is essentially, in hopefully what amounts to a short time of my remarks, and we can get into some Q&A, is what I want to sustain for you is that I don't think it's delusional, that belief in God generally and belief in the Christian message specifically is delusional, nor do I think it's actually dangerous. Now, this is not to try to whitewash over a lot of the issues that Christendom has had to face, and there are plenty. There's a history here we have to contend with, we have to deal with. But I want to go and speak on, I think, the fundamental worldview level, and then to speak to the person of the founder, the person after whom the religion is actually named, and say, what is his example, and what are the things that we should do and learn from that? Because we haven't always been consistent with this, not even close. So, I want to think about this first idea about, is it delusional? This first idea here, because I actually think that there's an interesting fact here. In order to determine if something is actually delusional, if some kind of belief is a persistent false belief in the face of strong contradictory evidence, or is just a completely wrong belief made up out of whole cloth, you have to have a plumb line. You have to have some kind of a standard by which you can actually measure whether something is delusional or not. You have to have a standard for rationality, a justifiable basis to believe in the existence of rationality in the first place. And so I would venture to say this, that we have struggled, honestly, when you look at all the literature, when you look at some of the work done on whether it's brain science or personality stuff, whatever it happens to be, we've struggled to find out where does human rationality actually come from? What is the fundamental and scientific or materialist basis for believing that human beings are rational in the first place? Because if you can't have a standard for what rationality is, then how can you actually determine if something's delusional? Because if we don't come to our beliefs based on reasonably drawn inferences, logical conclusions from observed data and evidence, then we actually don't have rationality. We just have belief systems based largely on survival characteristics. In other words, we believe things because that helps us and aids us in survival. We don't believe them because they're true. They might be true, they might be false. We don't know. All we know is they aid in survival. In fact, let me give you two quotes from some very heavy-hitting thinkers on these issues. One's name is Raymond Tallis. He wrote a book named Aping Mankind. Now, Raymond Tallis is an atheist. Raymond Tallis is a neurologist. Raymond Tallis is a champion of evolutionary biology and thought and evolutionary ideas. And in his book, Aping Mankind, this is what he says about whether or not rationality can be explained by merely evolution or neuroscience. This is what he says. It is a bitter irony that two of our greatest intellectual achievements, the theory of evolution and neuroscience, should be used to prop up a picture of humanity that is not only wrong, but degrading. I feel the misuse of bioscience all the more acutely since I have been a biologist of sorts all my life, a doctor and clinical scientist, and my research has been in the field of neuroscience, where I have seen huge advances that have amazed and inspired me. Listen now. The biologistic image of humans, in other words, a purely materialistic biology image of humans, effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility, of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. If On the Origin of Species really were the last word on humanity, it could not have been written. And if our consciousness really were totally explained by brain science, we would have had no brain science to explain it. What he's saying there is that we're trying to figure out where this idea of consciousness and human rationality actually comes from, and neither neuroscience or this obsession with neuroscience, which he calls neuromania, or this obsession with Darwinism to explain everything, which he calls Darwinitis. Remember, he's a neuroscientist and an evolutionist. He thinks these don't actually cut the muster. Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy out of New York University, in his book, Mind and Cosmos, where he does the same exact thing, where he's trying to find, or trying to describe that there is no really materialistic way in which you can describe or explain human consciousness in no purely materialistic way. This is what he says. An account of their biological evolution, meaning human beings and our consciousness, must explain the appearance of consciousness or conscious organisms as such. Since a purely materialist explanation cannot do this, the materialist version of evolutionary theory cannot be the whole truth. I want you to notice what he said. He didn't say that it has not done this yet. A materialist idea of our evolution or of our creation or of our existence does not do it. He's not saying it hasn't done it yet and we haven't discovered the way. He's saying, as a philosopher, one who has studied all of these various fields, what he said is, in principle, it cannot do this. It simply cannot be the whole picture. Simple materialism can't be. Now, there are those ideas outside of materialism. You can be an atheist and not be a materialist, pure materialist necessarily, but he's saying on this principle alone, the idea that we're just biological organisms cannot explain why we even think we're just biological organisms. Science as an endeavor, for example, only makes sense, I believe, if we are endowed with all of these faculties and all of these qualities that we're trying to search the explanation for. We're using the very science to find out how it is we even know how to do science in the first place. In other words, science is a method, drawing inferences that involves rationality. You draw inferences from observed data, and it involves rationality and free will. But if we're just biochemical machines, or sophisticated chips, as one might call us, then we don't actually have these things. We merely respond to external stimuli based on the chemical makeup of our bodies, based on the way in which we're chemically wired. So you'll respond to stimuli a certain way because of the chemical way in which the neurochemicals, all these various things in which you're made up of, and I'll respond a certain way to stimuli, but it's almost deterministic. You might respond and say, there is a God. I might respond and say, there is no God, or whatever other ideas you might have, but it's not really based on truth. It's just based on response or survival characteristic. What helps my genes go into the next generation? What is the thing that helps my progeny survive and succeed? Truth doesn't actually enter into the picture, and therefore rationality doesn't actually enter into the picture. To turn the objection on its head, I once heard a friend tell me that he was talking with someone who doesn't believe in God, and says, belief in God is like trying to drive a car without any gas in it. You might think it's going to go somewhere, and it looks impressive until you hit the floor, the pedal, and it doesn't go anywhere. That's kind of what you're talking about here. It looks impressive, but it's not really. And I remember thinking to myself, that's an interesting analogy, because I think if you flipped it on its head, I believe that being a purely materialist atheist, you might think, well, rationality exists, but your belief in rationality is actually a little bit different. It's like being in a car, going downhill, thinking that gas is propelling the car when it's really only gravity, and you'll be disappointed when the illusion is over. Because if a materialistic idea, if evolution isn't the game that explains rationality, if other neuroscience doesn't do it and other forms of it doesn't do it, there's only so many options left to us, and I think that the options that we're pointing to might be the best option, the one that actually, to me, best explains how we have rationality in the first place, where we can determine if things are delusional, is that this universe actually is intelligible because it is created by a supremely intelligent mind. And so the order you see, Einstein said it himself, one of the most unintelligible things about the universe is the fact that it is in fact intelligible. It should just be random, but it's not. It's ordered. There's something behind this that screams for an intelligence, which suggests that things are not random and that our intelligence actually comes. I think the best explanation for how we have intelligence is that there's something behind the design of you and me. Now I look at the natural world, and if you think about the Big Bang cosmology, the standard model of cosmology as it were, and here in a school where engineers are aplenty, where someone says, well, it's not rocket science. Well, here it's actually rocket science. You guys are all brilliant people, and you know your stuff. So I run a little bit of a risk here when I do this, of course. You realize that, having not been a rocket scientist myself. But I understand how the standard model actually works. And the standard model of cosmology is essentially this, that depending on the version you aspire to or ascribe to, all matter, energy, space, and time began to exist at a finite point in the past. All matter, energy, space, and time had some point of existence. some beginning to their existence. They didn't always exist, they began to exist. So if it's true that all matter came into existence, matter can't create itself because it has to pre-exist itself in order to create itself, and that's philosophically absurd. So matter can't be the thing that causes all these things. Energy, in order to create itself, can't actually pre-exist itself to create itself. That's also philosophically absurd. So the thing that creates energy has to be something outside of energy. Space and time, same thing. You can't have that. So if all matter, energy, space, and time come into existence, the force or the thing that is the cause of matter, energy, space, and time has to be an immaterial, enormously powerful, spaceless, and timeless cause. And that is sounding dangerously close to God. But then you look, I think, even closer still, from the telescopes to the microscopes, and look at the biological design of life and what it is for you and me to exist here. You take someone like Francis Collins, this brilliant man who was the head of the Human Genome Project, and he and his group had mapped the entire human genome and discovered that it was 3.1 billion bits of information long. 3.1 billion bits of information in the DNA strand of every human being. And there's trillions of those in your cells, and they replicate, and they cause new things to happen, and they cause proteins to synthesize, which causes more DNA to be created, so that can replicate as well. And this amazing dance of biology is here. And DNA is the blueprint by which this comes. It's this enormously complex code, far more complex than than any of the things that we've come up with ourselves. And Francis Collins, this brilliant man, says, look, this is not the work of accident. There's something behind all of this. There's something behind all of this. There's a mind behind the language of God. In fact, that's the name of the book he wrote. What he describes is the language of God. But I look into those molecules, and you see something deep and specific here about what it means to have this complexity. It's not just complexity, you see. Your biology and my biology, or even the biology of any organism in this world, any form of DNA, is not really complex. It's got a specified complexity. You know, I could take a box of alphabet cereal and I could spill it onto this stage. And that alphabet cereal will display itself in a complex array of letters that I will never be able to duplicate if I had a billion more tries with the same exact cereal and dump it out and dump it out. It will never be the exact same spacing or the exact same sequence. It just won't happen. So it's not that it's complex, and it's not that it's improbable. That's not what we're talking about here when we talk about the complexity of life. What we're talking about is a specified complexity. We're not talking about cereal being dumped out in a complex array. What we're talking about here is if you took that box of cereal and you shook it up and you dumped it out and it said, "Hi, Abdu, I hope you enjoy your breakfast." It's a specified complexity because it serves a function. It conveys actual information that can be used for something, not just random letters. Complexity isn't the issue. Random or improbability isn't the issue. Specified complexity is the issue, and you see that down deep within each one of us, you and me. You know, I think about Proverbs chapter 25, verse 2. And there's this interesting phrase in Proverbs 25:2. It says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to seek things out." It's a curious phrase, you know, because you think to yourself, why is it the glory of God to conceal something from us? We're playing catch up to him all the time, and it's like a game of cat and mouse. Or is this really describing something far more beautiful than that? What the Bible is describing in this verse is that God conceals a matter. It is the glory of God to conceal it, not so that you never discover it. It is the glory of kings to seek things out. God doesn't spoon feed us information and tell us everything there is to know, or that we could know on our own. Rather, he gives us the ability to discover that and engage in the delight of that discovery. That is what science really is. That is what even the humanities, the non-hard sciences, whether the social sciences or the humanities of various kinds, there's an element to discovery here that elicits some kind of reaction in you that engages in the sublimity of discovery itself. You know, years ago, many years ago now, my son's a second year in university. And years ago, when he was first born, a few years after he was first born, he's displayed an affinity, or a love, actually, for things with letters and numbers in them. And so, like every overzealous first dad, I bought him everything age wildly inappropriate for him to use with letters and numbers. You know, I'm thinking, okay, he's gonna, my son's the genius. This is the next Mozart, the next Einstein, the next whatever. That's what I thought. So, like every dad does. So, I bought him this laptop, although it's really not a laptop, it's kind of a fake laptop. It's a speak and spell, but it's shaped like a laptop to fool the kid into thinking he's got a computer. And it's a Spider-Man speak and spell. So we're sitting at the table, he's sitting next to me, and I'm talking to my wife. And we're talking about who knows whatever it was, I don't know. But I remember what happened afterwards, is that I hear this word emerge from my son's lips, very young. The word fat emerges from his lips. He goes, fat. I'm like, did he just, what? And I look at the screen, and sure enough, on the screen of this fake laptop are the letters F-A-T. He read those words. Like, did he just read that? So I hit the next word button, and the letter C-A-T come on the screen. And he says, cat, cat. I'm like, oh my goodness, my son can read. So I hit the button a bunch of times. Cat, fat, rat, bat, you know. All these words were going through the screen. He was seeing all these things, and he is squealing in delight because he is learning something he didn't know before. I can promise you, of the two of us, I was far more excited than he was. Why? Yes, there's something biological happening. Yes, there are endorphins coursing, and there are neurotransmitters being transmitted, and there are neuronic connections, neural connections being made, and that's happening, and there's something going on biological, but there's something about the communication between he and I over the delight of this discovery that is actually, I think, transcends just that merely physical thing, especially the fact that I know how to read. I know that cat isn't all that impressive. Unless you're 3. It is my delight as his father to see him discover something. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to seek things out. It's that his delight in discovery was my delight as well. And so I think that the biblical paradigm for the kind of God we're talking about, who creates you and me, 3.1 billion bits of information, yet none of that biology can fully explain the transcendence of your and my consciousness and your and my rationality. It's that God who I think about when I think about this one little thing in my house. I'm from Michigan. I have a lot of sweaters. It's cold there. Not yet, but it will get there. I got a lot of sweaters, man. And these sweaters, some sweaters have monetary value, you know. I bought those. Others were gifts, so they have sort of a sentimental value. There's one particular sweater in my house that has the most value. In fact, it's one of the most prized possessions in my home, and it's completely useless to anyone. It's this little purple sweater that doesn't even fit on my right hand, because it's the sweater that my mother knit when she was pregnant with me. She knit that sweater to bring me, I was born in February, so she was bringing me home from the hospital in that little sweater. So every time she was doing the cross, loop, hatch, whatever it is you do when you knit, whatever you do, she was thinking of me. My boy, Abdu, my son. I tell you that because she did that from a blueprint. There was a design, and there was a product. But the Bible doesn't describe you as a product. It doesn't describe you as a designed thing. It doesn't describe you as a product of manufacturing. No, what the Bible describes in Psalm 139 is something actually quite intimate. The same picture you have of a mother or a grandmother or whoever it is knitting something for someone else's use, like a baby yet to be born, that is an intimacy. Yes, there's the design. Yes, there's a template. But there's an intimacy to the act of creation in and of itself because of the person it's attached to. And so you see in Psalm 139, that beautiful statement. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. The Bible uses the word knitted when it comes to you and me and God's hand in your life and hand in your creation. It's not just an indifferent, pitiless force that creates you. It's something a little bit more intimate than that. I would say infinitely more infinite than that. But that leads to something. The next point, the dangerous point. See, I don't think that belief in God is delusional. I think that belief in God actually makes sense of rationality in the first place. And I think that as we plumb the depths of creation, whether it's the biological sciences or the physical sciences looking out into the universe, I think we see the signals of transcendence throughout all of it. But what is it getting to? This idea of being knit suggests that God cares, which suggests that you are valuable. And that's where the charge of dangerous really comes in. Because if we're inherently valuable, there's something valuable about human beings other than being meat computers and sophisticated chimps, why does Christianity seem to look the way it does sometimes when you look out into the media or you look out into your own life? Why does it seem to look like that? You know, I was visiting a city recently, Charleston, South Carolina. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's a great place to visit. It's a good place to vacation. It's on the coast. It's not like you need a place to go on the coast, though. You're kind of bored with coast, probably. You need mountains or something around here. I visited this city. It's a fascinating place because there's an ordinance in Charleston, South Carolina, where no building can be built higher than the tallest church steeple. In other words, a church has to be the highest point in Charleston, South Carolina. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that ordinance still exists. Although one church that you're talking about has a very, very high steeple. But no building can be higher than it. So the church is held in very high esteem, and it's been that way for a long time. In that same exact city where the church is so valued, there was a slave market. And so you wonder to yourself, there seems to be a contradiction here, or at least some kind of thing going on here, where you have this vaunting of a church that's based on the idea that God himself sent a son to die for the sake of all human beings, and yet human beings were treated like property. You say there's a disconnect at least, if not something worse going on here. And you have to deal with that. That's not something you can just brush past. We have to deal with it. Then you have my own experience. You know, yeah, you might not know this. I don't know if it was in the bio or not, but I'm a former Muslimite. I was born into a Muslim family. I became a believer at the age of 27 in Christ. But as an Arab, I can tell you, I've had my small tastes of the occasional discrimination here and there. I remember as a young boy, I was 11 years old, and I went to a pizza shop with my cousin and my brother. And I was 11 years old, and we went to this place, and it's one of those pizza shops, you know, where you don't walk in and sit down at a table. You just order the pizza, and then you leave with that pizza. Well, this was one of those places where we were on our bikes, and we were 11-year-old boys, and we're inherently disgusting. So we got our pizza, and we walked outside of the pizza shop, and we used a trash can as our table, which accounts for the fact that I'm not allergic to anything, I think, you know? So we use this trash can as a table. So I'm sitting there eating his pizza, strengthening my immune system, and I'm just looking back into the pizza shop I just left from. I was just in there. And I'm looking back into it, and I don't know what I was looking at. Certainly not anybody in the pizza shop. I was looking at maybe the glare or the reflection of the cars going back from me in front of the window that was there. But I looked past the glare, and there's the guy who literally just gave me my food, and he's looking at me. He's like 18 years old. He's looking at me, and he's got this look of contempt on his face, and he has his hand raised in an obscene gesture right at me, and he looks angry. And I don't know what compelled me, I'm 11 years old, I don't know what compelled me to walk into the shop and say, "Are you doing that to me?" And he said, "That's right, camel jockey, what are you gonna do?" I'm not sure what he expected. Did he expect that 11-year-old boy to get in a fight with a guy in the pizza shop over a racial slur? I'm not sure what he expected at that moment, but I can tell you what happened. What happened was I felt the slightest taste, the slightest bitterness of a diet that too many of us have experienced in this world. Whether you're a woman or you're a racial minority, whatever it is, you've experienced the scourge of being made to feel less just by virtue of what you are. I felt this little of a taste of it. It's a traumatic experience. And it wouldn't surprise me if he had worn a cross around his neck while he did it. I have no idea. I don't remember that element of it, but I do remember how I felt. Christianity is often blamed for racism, sexism, and plenty of things. And there's reasons to, in the history of Christendom, to say that label fits. But what I want to do is go to the source and ask ourselves the question, is what we see in terms of these dangerous ideas, these dangerous things, given all the polarization and politicization we see today, is it based on the root? Is it based on the actual source, whether it's the Bible or it's the person of Jesus, or is it based on an abuse of those things as well? So in the very brief time we have, before we get into Q&A here, because I want to race through some things, and I realize I won't do them all justice. I know it sounds like I'm selling a book when I say this. I sort of am. My book, More Than a White Man's Religion. And by the way, all the proceeds of that book go to feed hungry children. They just happen to be my children. The terrible joke that no one should laugh at. I go into detail here, but I want to talk about one thing in specific. When you talk about the way, for example, the Bible and slavery, this is an issue. This is a big issue we have to wrestle with. Does the Bible actually condone slavery? Now, when you look at certain words, of course, have connotation based on their context. My name, for example, Abdu, my name Abdu, it literally means slave. But it's an honorific. It means God's slave, or the servant of. It can mean slave. It can mean servant. It can mean one bonded to another person. And my name in Arabic is actually very close to the Hebrew word for slave, which could also mean servant, which is Obed. And it's also considered an honorific as well sometimes. Obadiah, for example, is the name of one of the prophets, and that's considered an honorific because the word slave is right in his name. So it can mean something honorific, like someone who's intentionally bonded to someone in service to that person because of love and loyalty and those kind of things. But it can mean someone who's a servant because of a debt. And so what the Bible doesn't condone, but it describes sometimes, is chattel slavery, slavery where someone is owned as property by another person. But what the Bible actually prescribes, or actually what I should say more like regulates, is actually not chattel slavery where someone's owned. What it regulates is what to do when someone owes you a debt and can be thrown in to debtor's prison, and how to actually deal with that person, or many people as well. And so someone owes a debt they can't pay, and they work that off. They have their service owned by another person until they work that debt off. And when the debt is worked off, they're to be set free. And in fact, every 7 years, if the debt isn't even paid off, that person must be set free. And even if the 7 years hasn't happened, but every 50 years, year of Jubilee, every servant, no matter how many debts they have, no matter how big the debt is required to be set free. And by the way, when they are set free, the person who owned their debt, their so-called master, is required to give of the ones who are set free, the Bible says liberally, from their own property, their cattle, and their money. Why? So that the person never enters into debt again. The whole system is to regulate servitude out of the world, not to perpetuate the whole thing. Now, do I think there are people who tried to use these kinds of things to baptize their evil? I think absolutely that's the case. But it's interesting that you see this. When you go on, you can do it right now. Go to Amazon right now, and you can buy a thing called the Slave Bible. The Slave Bible is an edited Bible. It removes all references to the Exodus. It removes all references to spiritual and physical liberation from oppression and from captivity. It edits that out. Why? Because the slave owners knew in the transatlantic slave trade, especially here in antebellum South as well, they knew that if the slaves ever learned to read and got a hold of this Bible, they would see something of liberation and equality in that. And we can't have that because they might rebel if that happens. And we can't have them see that. So here comes the question. If the Bible was so pro-slavery based on race and owning people as property, why did the slave owners need to edit it at all? They would just let them have it and say, see, this is your rightful place. But they had to edit it. And by the way, there's no real hint in the Bible that any of this is based on ethnicity, that Israel is God's chosen people. Yes, that's what the Bible describes, but it's not chosen because their DNA or their complexion or whatever it is happens to be better than other people. We're talking about largely a Middle Eastern population who looks exactly like everybody else. There's almost no distinction when you go to the Middle East. There is ethnicity and there's ethnic differences, but that is not the reason why God judges anybody. God uses Israel as a judgment against other peoples You know, the Anakites, the Amalekites, the Canaanites, and whatever other ites were running around. God uses Israel as a judgment against them, but it's not an ethnic issue, because you notice something. Whenever Israel does the exact same abominable things, like child sacrifice and temple prostitution and marauding and cheating and murders of nearby tribes for no good reason, whenever Israel herself does those things, God uses those foreign nations as instruments to judge Israel. So it's not an ethnic thing at all. In fact, I would suggest this to you. When you look at the way in which God metes out his judgment in the Old Testament, God never does it based on the color of someone's skin. He always does it based on the content of their character. That ought to sound familiar. Dr. King did not pull that out of the sky. Well, I guess he kind of did. But that ethic is found in something that inspired him to pursue equity and equality. In fact, Frederick Douglass, no less luminary a person than Frederick Douglass, pointed something out beautiful. This is a man who was a freed slave. This is a man who, if you read any of his stuff, and by the way, do yourself the favor of reading anything Frederick Douglass writes. He is brilliant, one of the most brilliant minds to walk the soil of this country. He recognized something. If anybody had a reason to think that Christianity was the slavers' religion, it was this man. And he wrote something where he actually points out that the authentic Christianity of the Bible, the Christianity of Christ, he says, was being abused by the slavers. It wasn't the kind of thing that justified any of the race-based hate that he saw. Listen to what he says. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. He was speaking to the slave owners. He was speaking to those who allowed them to persist and saying, if you want to follow Christ, you would end this thing. And eventually we did. Then you look to the issue of gender and women. Oftentimes it's been the case that Christianity has been labeled with the idea of being sort of misogynistic. You know, I don't know if you guys saw the Barbie movie. Apparently it was the thing to see. I saw it, by the way. And you see this word patriarchy, right? And patriarchy is this word, it's actually considered a disease in the movie. It's literally likened to smallpox in the movie. And it's a tough thing because, you know, we often refer to the sort of the male prominent figures in the Bible as the patriarchs. So you can see sort of a link between these two things. And the idea is that patriarchy, and therefore the patriarchs, and therefore the Bible, is inherently misogynist and sexist. But is it? And that's the question. You know, you look to the significant figures of the Bible, including in the Old Testament, of women, and you see entire books of the Bible named after women. In fact, non-Jewish women, like the book of Ruth. She's considered, in fact, she's so important that she's considered to be important enough to include in the genealogy of Jesus himself, the Savior of the world. Her genealogy, her influence in that is enough to put her in a great hall of fame, as it were, in the Christian scriptures. The book of Esther. In Esther, you have a woman who is actually so prominent that she's willing to risk her life to save her entire people from the hands of the Persians. Don't look now, by the way, but that whole thing is an actual foreshadowing of the Christ who is to come, who saves people from their sins. He saves his people, so to speak, from their sins. And Esther is a prefiguration of that. A woman was given the honor of being a precursor to the Savior of the world. I can go on and on about this, but you look at various stories about the way Jesus treated women. Over and over again. He vaunts their value in so many incredible ways. In so many incredible ways. You know, you read this story of Mary and Martha in the Bible. If you're not familiar with it, it goes like this. Mary and Martha, two sisters, are having Jesus and his disciples, you know, Jesus and the boys are coming over for dinner. And like Middle Eastern women normally do, and Middle Easterners typically do, is they leave no stone unturned in their quest for hospitality. They're going to roll out the red carpet and all this stuff. Well, Martha is very, very busy. She's a worker. And Mary, before the party starts essentially, is sitting at Jesus' feet learning from him. Now that's not considered an insult, by the way. It was considered an honor for any man to sit at the feet of a rabbi. And no women were allowed back then to sit at the foot of a rabbi. That was considered to be only men could do. Women were denied educations back then. Mary's in the kitchen doing her thing, and she is now so acculturated, she's so used to being put in her place, which is that kitchen, that when she sees a woman step outside of that place, she's offended. And she says to Jesus, Jesus, don't you care that she's left me to do all the work? Tell her to come and help me. You notice what she didn't say? She didn't say, Jesus, would you come help me? Because she would never ask a man to do that. That's not a man's place. Her place is in the kitchen, and so is Mary's. And she's offended by this woman who desired to go outside the boundaries. And what does Jesus tell her in that gentle, sort of rebukish way, but so gentle? He says, Martha, Martha, you are worried about many things, but Mary has chosen what is better, this education, and it will not be taken from her, not even by you. She chose it. She had free will. And women in that area of the world at that era of time had very little of either education or free will. And Jesus says, she's not going to be robbed of either of those things. And you see this throughout his life over and over again. So much so that Michael Kruger made this point. He made the point that Christianity was not mocked by the pagans and by the other religious beliefs in the early first centuries because it was anti-women. It was mocked because it was considered the religion of women and children. In other words, women were flocking to it, not because it was sexist and misogynist, but because it gave them that sense of their value. Those women knew the difference, and they saw something in Christ and in the early church that he had birthed. Let me close with this. There's this, dangerous, delusional, there's this charge against Christianity, and there's some things to it that we have to address in terms of the way in which we've misused and abused the name of Christ and the book that tells us of his life. There's a lot to reckon with, there really is. But this whole idea that rationality can just emerge as an epiphenomenon from human beings, it finds no real weight in the literature. This idea that all of the dangerousness is inherent in the person himself of Jesus or in the movement that he birthed, it finds no real weight in history. We have nowhere else to look to, I think, to try to survive these ills, other than, I think, the very thing that's being blamed for those ills, which is the gospel message. David Bentley Hart said this: "It is simply the case that we distant children of the pagans would not be able to believe in any of these things. Care for the indigent, loving your neighbor, taking care of the oppressed, equality of the person. We would not be able to believe in any of these things." Listen to what he says. "They would never have occurred to us had our ancestors not once believed that God is love, that charity is the foundation of all virtues, that all of us are equal before the eyes of God, and to fail to feed the hungry or care for the suffering is to sin against Christ, and that Christ laid down his life for the least of his brethren." We have an Arabic phrase. Arabic phrases are far more colorful than American phrases. We have this phrase, we're all in the same boat. Meaning, we're all in the same boat, same problem, or we cause the same issue. In Arabic, we have a phrase that's kulna fil hawa sawa, which is we're all in the same wind, we're all in the same air. The connotation is we all smell the same stink. We created this. We're in a predicament that we ourselves created. And I think the only rational way to look at it is we need someone who's not us to save us from us. But we need to understand each other, friends. We really do. Because the charge of danger is real. We have to take it seriously. But there's a lot of polarization on all sides. What I hope to do during the Q&A as we bring this to a close is to try to understand each other a little bit better. It reminds me of that poem by Thomas Bracken. Bracken said this: "Not understood, we move along asunder. Our paths grow wider as the seasons creep. Along the years we marvel and we wonder why life is life, and then we fall asleep. Not understood. not understood, how many breasts are aching for lack of sympathy. Ah, day by day, how many lonely, cheerless hearts are breaking. How many noble spirits pass away, not understood. And then he says, oh God, that men would see a little clearer, or at least judge less harshly when they cannot see. Oh God, that men would draw a little nearer to one another. Perhaps they would draw nearer to thee, and then be understood. I think that there is something about our creation that isn't just happenstance. And if we recognize that inherent image of God in each one of us, then when you look at someone who disagrees with you, when you look at someone who's struggling with an issue, when you look at someone who has a belief system that's fundamentally different than yours, you don't see an enemy to be vanquished. You see someone to be understood. And then maybe you could be understood too. That we can come together and find out where the truth really lies. I suggest to you it's in the person of Christ, the person by whom and through whom the very things that separate us, the very sins that we're talking about that make this world dangerous, were actually dealt with. Thank you guys so much. We'll take questions.
Abdu, thank you so much for sharing with that. That was absolutely amazing. So right now we are going to move on to the second portion of our night, which is the Q&A. So really quick, I'm just going to cover with you guys how this is going to work. So we have our lovely John and Jacob. They are going to be our mic people for tonight. Oh, it's just John. Pardon me. So we just have John tonight. He's going to be our mic person. John is right there, as you can see. And the way this is going to work is that if you guys have a question that you want to ask, just we ask that you form a line in front of John, and then you will be able to ask your question. And then we do have a couple of rules that we would like to go over. So just some ground rules. So number one, questions only. Let's not do speeches or rants. Number two, try to keep your questions short, concise, and brief, as we do want to give other people the chance to ask their questions as well. And three, you may just ask one question for tonight, again, because we do want to give everyone else the chance to ask their questions as well. So thank you guys so much, and let's get to it.
So by the way, if we have follow-up questions, don't worry about it. I won't say, one question, that's it. It's not like a question like gulag in here. That's okay. So the first question is typically the hardest question to ask. So we'll just go to the second question. Or the third one. Here we go. Here's a question. All right. Tell me your name, sir.
My name is Stefan Messiah.
Okay.
So my question has to do with the idea of, because you started by talking about slavery and how the Bible doesn't promote that. And I was thinking about the idea of progressive Christianity, which kind of promotes, I don't know, keeping people in spiritual slavery. So it's how do we, now that we're on the other side of it, escape the idea of progressive Christianity, which seeks to embrace everyone, but in a negative way, because it doesn't enlighten them to the truth of being freed from their sins in that way. Like, how do we balance that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think it really depends on how we define a progressive Christianity, and I think I know what you're talking about. So there are two things that are really important, okay? And I've written a bit about this in a book, one book called Saving Truth, and really about the post-truth culture. And what the post-truth culture is, you know, we're not really postmodern anymore. We keep using the word postmodern like we're postmodern. We're not. Postmodernism was the idea that, among many ideas, was one of the ideas that there's no such thing as objective truth. Everything is a matter of opinion, and so if we can get rid of all the conflict in the world, if we just get rid of the idea of objective truth, that way you won't try to force your truth on me, I won't try to force my truth on you, whether it's political or social or religious or economic, whatever it is, and everything will be fine. Well, of course, that didn't work out, because the minute you say there's no such thing as objective truth, you've already committed a fallacy, right? Because that statement has to be objectively true. And if the statement is true, then there is such a thing as truth, in which case you've sawed off the limb on which you're sitting. So that died its death. But what rose up from the ashes of postmodernism, I believe, is something that looks very similar to it, but is very different. It's post-truth. And a post-truth culture is one that doesn't deny that truth exists. A post-truth culture is a culture that elevates feelings and preferences above facts and truth. So what you feel matters more than the truth, even if the truth happens to conflict with your preferences or your feelings. We'll just put that on the side, in the back, or in the lowest rung of the ladder, or in the closet on some shelf somewhere. But if the truth happens to coincide with my beliefs, well, then the truth is all that matters. You know, it's all a matter of convenience with this kind of thing. Why do I bring this up? Why I bring this up is because there is a desire. I get this. I get the desire to make the gospel message, the Bible itself, the person of Christ, more palatable to a culture that seems to be increasingly post-Christian. You know, so we have different views on marriage and sexuality and what it means to be human and all these things. And so those are the things where the culture is going. And so in order to bring people into church, to not make them feel repulsed, because we want to have acceptance, we want to have people who come in, but we can't compromise the message either for that, because now we're just luring them into something that's not really the thing that the book teaches. So folks will start to reinterpret what the book teaches or what Jesus himself actually taught in order to make that more palatable to the outside world. And that's a preference. I want them to like me, so I'm going to change the message to be more likable. That's a preference over truth. The truth is sometimes uncomfortable, and that's just the reality of life. The other side of it, though, is different too. We have plenty of Christians who want to take as many Bible verses as they can and clonk you over the head with them to make you feel terrible. So it's as if they don't want you to come to their church. And that's a post-truth thing too, because the Bible doesn't actually make that statement. So I think the method here, the way in which we actually deal with a progressive Christianity that takes a message and says, I want to change what the actual message is to make it more palatable, I think there's two things you can do. The first thing is to actually act like you like people, no matter what their beliefs actually are. And then maybe they'll say, I'm okay with disagreeing with you because you are actually a person who I can disagree with without feeling like you hate me. That's one way. The second way is to abide in that truth, but speak that truth in love. The Bible specifically says, speak the truth in love. And I fear that we would have no need for a progressive Christianity if our love was as progressive as our truth. Now this is interesting because the Bible actually says something. The Bible says something specific. Jesus claims to be the truth. The Bible says God is love. Jesus claims to be God, which means that love and truth are almost equal, they're equal to each other. If God is love and God is truth, then truth and love are almost inseparable. And yet we do a job of separating those two things all the time. And I think that if I were to make a self-indictment of what the church has done wrong, is that we've spoken truth without love, or we've compromised truth for the sake of love, and we've never actually gotten the balance of both right. One guy did. He did it right. And it's his example we should look at. 2,000 years ago when he walked this earth, and he challenged those who tried to oppress people because of religiosity, that you're hypocrites and liars because you're not actually teaching the truth. But he also challenged those who wanted to live a sinful life and saying, you're living a sinful life because you're running from the truth. And maybe these religious people are the ones who are making you run from it. He embodied something so far different. So I think we wouldn't even need to worry about these kind of movements that play with and water down the Bible if we lived the truth, even some of the uncomfortable truths of the Bible, but we did so in a way that was loving and said, I can disagree with you without being disagreeable. I can debate without hate. I can give you the dignity of difference. Doesn't mean you compromise on the truth. It just means you actually adapt your method. I think that's the way to do it. And I think that can bring liberty. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, absolutely. I hope there's another one. Sort of have this strobe light effect happening with that light. So, yeah, is there another question coming? Yeah, here we go. Here they come. Yeah. Yeah. Here we go. How are you, sir?
Very good, very good.
Thank you. Tell me your name.
My name's Danny O'Brien.
Danny?
Danny, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Danny.
All right. So my question is, you spoke of there being a sort of objective truth, and that truth being Jesus and his word told through the gospel/Bible.
Yeah.
My question is, there are many denominations of Christianity which talk about the truth of the Bible, yet they differ in many ways. So how then is there one authentic, true interpretation of the Bible, and who determines that?
Yeah. Next question, please. No, I'm kidding. That's a great question, Danny. That's a great question, Danny. Thank you so much for the question. You know, it's funny because, and you can stay there if you like to. I'd like to address you directly. It's a great question. So C.S. Lewis made a point at trying to talk about what he called mere Christianity. And on this mere Christianity, what we have is universal agreement. You have some sects that are out there, S-E-C-T-S, don't get your mind there, where you have people who differ on certain fundamental truths of the Christian message. And what you've noticed is that they're decided minorities, but they also compromise on some of what are called the essentials. So if you look at Lutheranism or Catholicism or Protestantism or various Episcopalian ideas or whatever, there are certain ideas that are traditionally been debated and differed on. Predestination and human free will, what role do those play? Baptism as an infant, what role does that play? Should you be baptized as an infant? Should you be baptized as an adult? Gifts of the Spirit, should you be able to speak in tongues or not? These kind of issues are peripheral issues that have been debated. What is not being debated, and the reason why those are debated is because a lot of those verses in the Bible are either ambiguous in their wording because Greek as a language recepted into English typically, or other languages, you always have a little bit of a translation issue. You just always do. But part of it too is that not only is there ambiguity maybe in the actual text, but there's actually ambiguity in the context in which they were given. And so some folks will say, well, that was for them. Others will say, no, that's for today, in various different ways. But you'll notice something. Those are peripheral issues. What the church has not actually wavered on in terms of interpreting what the Bible actually says and what the early church fathers would actually propagate. In other words, the disciples and then the disciples of the disciples. You see a chain of custody, as it were. I'll use a lawyer term. You see a chain of custody where people are passing along certain ideas that are not changing depending on where you go. So the fall of humanity. First of all, God exists. There's only one God, not changed. That God created humanity in his likeness and in his image, not a changed issue. Humanity fell in its sinful state and now is in need of redemption. Jesus, as the second person of the Trinity, comes and incarnates himself, having no debts of his own to pay, so he can pay your and my debt to God because of what we've done in rebellion against him. And so he pays that debt on the cross. Again, a non-negotiable that has not been changed. 3 days later, he rises from the dead bodily. Again, not an issue that has been changed over time. And then the coming, eventually, of Jesus, so that we call upon his name as the one who saves us, and he proves that he can save us through his resurrection, but he's coming again. You look at those key truths, and those are the truths about there was almost complete uniformity of belief on those issues, save for some outliers, of course. But it's the denominations are based on not the changes in the central ideas, the verifiable ideas, or the clearly interpreted ideas. It's based on the peripheral issues. Those are the issues they disagree on and differ on. But they're not salvation issues, and Lutherans don't consider Baptists to be heretics, and Episcopalians consider some other, no, I'm just kidding, but Presbyterians, they all have this sense of uniformity. Now, unity. This is an important thing. Unity does not mean uniformity. We don't even have that in this room. Here we are at a university, which means unity in diversity. It's a unity of diverse opinions. And we don't even have that in this room, yet we all share a common goal, and some common truths inherent. Like, for example, that all human beings have inalienable rights. Now, how do you express that a little differently? We might have different political theories, left, right, center, Republican, conservative, Democrat, whatever it happens to be. But we all kind of believe the idea that we have inalienable rights, among them our chief, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there's core central things we agree on, even though the periphery we disagree on. Now, who's right about all those various things? You know, I saw a cartoon once, and it was a picture of Jesus. It was a cartoon of Jesus in this Edenic garden setting, and it's heaven. There's this little girl sitting on his lap, and she's the only one. And she says, Jesus, where is everyone else? And he said, well, all of their theology was a little bit off. So the idea being that, you have to have your perfect theology to get into heaven, which is a joke. That's why it's in a cartoon. The point is, a lot of us are going to actually be surprised about how right we were and how wrong we were about some of these things. And when we divide over these things, we create schisms that were never intended to be there. But there are central issues. We can disagree about the periphery, but it's the central issues of the Christian faith that I think are the ones that we don't necessarily, there's no real room, I think, to negotiate, because some of those things are pretty perspicacious, they're clear. There's a famous saying, some think Augustine said it, I don't know who exactly said it, but he said, in the Christian faith, what you have is, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, but in all things, charity. So we try to understand one another and come to grips with these issues, but we shouldn't divide over them. I hope that helps, Danny. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Nolan.
Noel?
Nolan, N-O-L-A-N.
Oh, Nolan.
I'm a bit nervous. Okay. So, say, because you talk about how God is self-evident in how we function, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So, say every influence of every religion just vanishes, poof, right now. How would we be able to find God again?
So that's interesting. Great question, Nolan. Thank you. If the influence of every religion vanished, just went away, how would we be able to find God again? If I'm right, that God is evident in how we function. Is that kind of the question? Is that fair? Okay. Well, you'll notice something. In my discussion, what I didn't do was say that at first, I think you can't believe in human rationality, or you can't justify, I shouldn't say believe it. You can believe in it all you want, because I think it is there. But you can't justify how we have it, absent belief in God. I don't mean in Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity. I don't mean that. I just mean that it came from somewhere other than naturalistic processes. So how would we find him? It's interesting you say that, because the Bible actually talks about a couple of things. Now, I realize the Bible is no longer an influence in your hypothetical. I get that. But what the Bible describes is something about human nature that I think is actually there. And it corresponds. It's one of the reasons why I like the Bible so much, is because so many of the things it says actually correspond with the human experience. So the very fact that you look around in this world, the Bible describes a situation where you can look around. You don't have to have special revelation. You don't have to have a Bible or a Quran or anything like that. You can look around the world around you, and you see the way that it's created. And you see that these things are either necessary things or they're contingent things. A necessary thing is something that doesn't have a cause. Everything seems to be contingent. Everything seems to have a cause. And so something would have caused these things. And they're so specified in their complexity. The Bible actually talks about that idea of specified complexity, not in those terms, of course, but it predicts that we would think about these things in terms of the design of life, the design of the universe. And so what the Bible basically tells me and tells you is that you can actually see that there's a God out there, that there's a being higher than you, a being who's responsible from all this, just by looking around. So you can, whether you'll know who that God actually is or what he wants from you, you might not be able to know that just from looking at trees and mountains and waterfalls and, slugs and paramecium. But you will see a designer behind it all. You will see that. In fact, Francis Crick, who I quoted earlier, he said this. He was admonishing scientists, and I'm going to paraphrase him. Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate who discovered, along with Watson, the structure of the double helix of DNA, he said this: a scientist who's looking at biological systems has to constantly remind himself that this is not designed, because the design appearance is so strong. So you can find that there is someone who created this world without ever having to open up a Bible. That's like, my goodness, this doesn't look like it was just an accident. I mean, things that are this complex don't just happen, especially when they have function to them. That's one. Number two, all you need to do is look inside your own heart, in my heart. If you look into your own heart, you'll notice something. I look into my heart every day, and I notice something. I fall quite short of the standards I set for myself, let alone a perfect standard, let alone a perfect moral standard. I believe in the existence of objective morality. I think that necessitates God's existence, of course, but that's another issue altogether. But I recognize that I fall short. And I recognize this over and over and over again, that I need someone who's not me to save me from me and from my fellow human beings who also need to be saved from themselves. And something needs to happen, some kind of a spiritual transaction, some kind of a thing that's done for me and then to me to change me. And by the way, you'll notice something. There's a string of this thought, this idea of the need of redemption, through almost every form of literature, whether it's religious or non-religious as well. There's an inherent recognition in the human mind and in the human heart that we need something to save us from us. So you already have half the gospel already just by introspection and by looking out into the world. There's a God who designed it. We've fallen short of his standards. We need someone who's not us to fix us from us. That's what a Savior does. And so you don't even need the Bible to get there. Do we have the Bible? Thank God we do, I say, because it tells us more about who this God actually is, that he specifically, in the person of Jesus, came and said, I will not leave you in that circumstance. I will do what you cannot do and do it for you so that you can have that salvation. So I quoted the Bible just now a bunch of times. Not to say the Bible is the Word of God. Why? Because the Bible says so. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the Bible describes reality as it actually is. And so all the truths that we recognize, or that we should see in the world, the design of life, the design of the universe, a creator who is beyond all of us, whose standards we don't meet, and we need someone to help us to meet those standards, that's almost the entire gospel already, and I didn't even open the book yet. So I think that's how we get back there. But I'll tell you this, Nolan, I think the interesting thing is that there's been a lot of efforts over the courses of the millennia to get rid of that book, to get rid of the biblical influence, and yet it's here. There's been social, there's been military, there's been religious attempts to get rid of the influence of the Bible, and yet it still remains the most influential book in the history of the world, and it probably always will. Voltaire said in his lifetime that the Bible would be a forgotten book, and yet, for a short time, the French Bible Society used Voltaire's house as its offices. As one person said, the Bible often rises to outlive its pallbearers. So its influence will never wane, but in your thought experiment, the gospel truth is evident, I think, in the world. Thank you so much, Nolan. It's an excellent question. I hope I helped you.
How you doing?
Hi.
Hi. So you said earlier that you shouldn't, hit people with a bunch of Bible verses, make them realize they're a terrible person. But Jesus tells us, hey, these are the consequences if you don't turn from those sinful ways. Plus the Apostle Paul tells us that the purpose of the law is to show us just how sinful we are.
Yeah.
So how should we approach those things?
Yeah, hopefully I didn't communicate that we can't speak the truth. I was saying we have to speak the truth about these things in love. One of the first ways you can actually speak the truth is to not actually live the sins you condemn, or be proud of those sins that you condemn. Now, I'm not saying you have to live perfectly, because that ain't happening. And if you could do that, you wouldn't need Jesus. Rather, I think it's to live authentically. It's to live transparently, to confess your sins one to one another that you may be healed. That's what the Bible says. But I think also we can point out these things, but I think the important thing, speaking the truth in love, isn't just saying what the Bible says about certain actions, conditions, whatever it is. It's about saying why it says it. Why does it say those things? Because the world is, and I get this, the world is basically saying, you keep saying that, and that's a dusty old book written by dusty old men for a dusty old time to justify their bigotry. You're like, okay, that's one charge. Or we can look into why it says what it says, because people do feel a sense of conviction in what they're doing wrong. Or if they feel that it's right, they need to be, well, why do you think that it's wrong? And is that bigotry or is that something more? So I think that the way to do this isn't to be quiet, but it's to actually shout something different. And not even necessarily shout it, sometimes whisper. Sometimes a caress of words can be as impactful as powerful rhetoric. And so if you point out why the Bible says the things it says, you might get people to listen to you a little bit longer. They might reject it, but at least they're rejecting the real thing, not a caricature they've heard from somebody else who's angry. They've heard it from you as a person who tries to live by that standard, recognizes his shortcomings, but then says, there's a why behind all of this, and I want to offer that to you. So it's not being quiet, it's saying the right things and doing the right things in a way that is compelling, not by compromise, but by conviction. Thank you. Yeah. Hi there.
Hi. So I have just a more broad question. It's since we do go to a STEM school, I think science is a really important thing to most of us here. And I was just wondering, does Darwinism or evolution or natural selection play a role in the creation process, or should that be completely discarded as being materialist and atheist? And that kind of goes to the broader question of how literal should the Bible be taken? Was the earth created in 6 days, and should all its miracles and all its glory be taken at face value, or is it more metaphorical and poetic?
Yeah. What's your name?
Eliel.
Elliot wins the prize for the most loaded question. No, it's a great question. It's a great question, Elliot. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it, actually. So I may ask you to repeat part of it if I forget. But so let me say the part on evolution. There are a spectrum of people who believe different things based on the Bible about how God created everything. Now, there are people like people who believe in a literal 6-day creation, that when the Bible describes the earth being created in 6 days, they think that word day is literally 24-hour period of time, and things were created in 6 days, which means that the earth is actually quite young. The universe itself is quite young. And that's one way to interpret the Bible. There are other people who believe that the earth is quite old, and that word day in the Bible, these are Bible-believing Christians, people who actually believe that the Bible says what it says and means what it says, but that word day can mean literally millions of years. Because a day could be an unspecified period of time. So for example, in the days of Noah, well, how many days? You don't mean any specified period of time. You mean an unspecified period of time. Where back in my day, well, which day? February 12th, 1963? You don't mean that, right? You mean an unspecified period of time. And you literally mean back in my day. So there's also people who believe that the earth is extremely old and God used evolution in order to create us. That God set the plan into motion, knowing what the result would be, so he set the initial conditions so that human beings would arise. And those are called evolutionary creationists, also called evolutionary design. So those are at least three. There are at least three more interpretations that I could think of. And what they're all trying to do is they're trying to take the biblical data and the various possible interpretations of the biblical data, and then take the scientific data and say, if God exists, this is the key, Elliot. If God exists, and he is a God of order, because this universe seems to be ordered and predictable, that's how science is done. If you can't predict what's going to happen next, then you can't do science. If this world is ordered and predictable, then the God who creates it wouldn't be a God of disorder and irrationality and bedlam and chaos and contradiction. So that means this. If he has a specifically revealed book, which is the Bible, and he has a general revelation, which is the world, because the Bible does specifically say, you look around and you are without excuse for believing in God because the world seems to cry out that God exists. So we have the book of nature and the book of the Bible. If God is the author of both, they shouldn't contradict. What happens when they seem to? Well, you can take a couple of ways. You can say, well, the Bible's just wrong. Or our science is wrong. And science is provisional. I'm not saying it's like completely ambiguous, but science is provisional. We hold certain theories, and then when we find that they've been disproven, we move on to the next one and formulate hypotheses and null hypotheses and all these things and try to get to the truth. We're getting better and better at these kind of things, typically. So it could be that our interpretation of the Bible is wrong. Not that the Bible is wrong, but the way we see it is wrong. And the science is right. Or maybe our science isn't being interpreted correctly, and the Bible's actually right about this. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So there's a thing called the ENCODE project, and it's actually going on. There's a number of iterations of this happening right now. The ENCODE project is a project whereby people are trying to figure out if the genome, the human genome, the genetic code in the human DNA actually has function beyond the, I can't remember the percentage, 4 or 6% that actually does anything. So I don't know if you know this, but for the most part, about between 4 and 6% of the human DNA actually does anything in terms of encode for proteins. So a lot of people who believe that mindless, indifferent, aimless evolution created humanity. We weren't created with a prevision or a design in mind. There was no creator behind all this. So they thought that that 94% of DNA that didn't do anything is just junk DNA. It's vestiges from previous iterations of our evolution, and you'd expect to see that if evolution were true, you'd see all this junk DNA. It doesn't do anything anymore because we don't need it to do anything. We needed to have bigger muscles and more hair on our bodies, and we don't need that anymore because we're smarter, we create heating and air conditioning and all these kind of things, right? So we don't need that anymore, so it's junk left over. The ENCODE project comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should challenge this assumption that that DNA is actually junk. Maybe it actually encodes for something. Maybe it does something. It doesn't encode for proteins, we know that. But what we've discovered, the more and more we study the human genome, is the things we thought was junk is actually doing stuff that allows the other 4% to encode for DNA, to encode for proteins. So that so-called junk DNA isn't so junky after all. It's beginning, we're learning more and more, it's serving more and more of a function. Here's what I would say to you, Elliot, is that a belief that all of this is undesigned led to the assumption of junk DNA. The belief that this might have a design led to the idea that maybe we should see if that's right or not. So science took a leap forward, and had we assumed earlier on that maybe there's a designer to all this, we'd have found out the functions decades ago instead of just now. The reason why I say that is because scientists sometimes hold their theories provisionally and are starting to realize, I think the more you delve into the biology and the microbiology of human life, you're beginning to see a lineup with the Bible. So, can you believe the earth was created in 6 days and interpret the Bible that way and think that that's the way to do it? I think that's one possibility. Do I happen to think that the science lines up with that? I tend to think that the science is a little bit more advanced now that we know some things about the age of the earth, and I think that there is a good argument to be made that the interpretation of the Bible that is probably a little more responsible on those words is that the earth is actually quite old, and that day doesn't actually literally mean day. In fact, the seventh day doesn't even end. You notice that there's no ending to the seventh day in the Bible. We're still in it. So there's a way to interpret this, I think, responsibly, without question begging, without fudging the data, where we can see that maybe this universe is quite old. Does that mean evolution is necessarily the way things happened? I am skeptical, honestly, about that. I think that the evidence is showing more and more that you have, when the Cambrian explosion, all these other things, you have sudden speciation, and you have all this design that doesn't comport, I think, with evolution. But can you be a Christian and believe that God used evolution? I quoted Francis Collins earlier today. Francis Collins believes that, and he is a devoted Christian. So I think we should divide on these things. I think we should debate on these things and try to come to a consensus together. The second question was about literalness. Should we take the Bible literally? I think, here's my rule. This is not my rule. This is not the Abdu rule of interpretation, by the way. This is, a lot of people think this before I even became a Christian, is we should take the Bible in the sense it was intended. Sometimes it's intended to be taken literally. Other times it's intended to be taken literarily. So for example, and I'm quoting from John Lennox now, mathematician out of Oxford. He points out, he says, Jesus says, I am the door. Is that literal or figurative? Figurative, right? Because he's not made of wood and hangs on a hinge, right? But he's literally a door to the Father. So the Bible should be taken in the sense it was intended, and so sometimes even the figurative is actually literal in another sense. But do I think the Red Sea actually parted? Yeah, that wasn't a symbol. Do I think Jesus actually rose from the dead physically? I think the Bible's clear on that, and I don't need to make it into a metaphor. I can justify that through history. So you have to be careful to make sure you take the Bible in the sense it was intended. There's poetry, there's prose, there's lament, there's history, There's accounts, there's biographies, all that kind of stuff. So you have to be careful about the genre in which you're looking at it. And I think Genesis has a tremendous amount of sequential and literal meaning to it, but that literal meaning can mean different things based on how you use the word. If I say the word foot, I'm being literal. Do I mean the thing at the end of my legs, or do I mean a 12-inch distance? You don't know until the context tells you. But I'm literally talking about a foot. He's got to figure out what I mean by that. I think that's how you look at the Bible as well. It's not always an easy task, but no great document that's ever influenced history is like that. The Constitution's like that. So we have to be ever careful about these things and take this book as seriously as possible. I hope that's a helpful starting point, Elliot. Thank you so much for your question. Yes, sir.
How's it going?
How are you?
Doing well, thanks. So I got my question written here. Looking back in the history of the church, there are periods defined by false beliefs. For example, the church promoting slavery, like you talked about, or paying the church for forgiveness with indulgences. What flaw do you think hindsight will reveal about the church in this era, if any?
Now that, my friend, is a good question. What was your name again?
Brett.
Brett? Great question, Brett. That's interesting. I think that there's going to be a time, history has this ability, future historians have this ability to look back and say, what were they thinking? Until we run into a situation where we're wondering what we're thinking at the time. So we're constantly sort of surprised by sometimes our idiocy, no matter how sophisticated we think we are. I mean, I want you to think about this for a second. I got this machine over here, okay? Got this machine. We call these phones for some reason. Who makes calls on these anymore? No one calls anybody on these things. But this machine, my one phone, has more computing power than all the computers that sent the first rockets to the moon. That's how powerful this one machine is. Now, what do we do with this one machine? I scroll endlessly, mindlessly, clicking like, just because I want to make sure someone likes me. I look at things I ought not look at. I'm not saying me specifically, I'm saying us generally as human beings. We objectify people. We look at material that makes people into objects of our gratification. We cyberbully. We cancel. We spew hate. So we're quite sophisticated, but we're still quite moronic. We're like these zombies, these sort of like hunched over Neanderthals that walk around like this, looking at one thing. Can you imagine a world where your entire worldview is limited to 6 square inches? I think that's one of the things that we're going to look back on and say this is what the church and humanity has done to itself. It's funny too, because you think about this sophisticated machine that we use to objectify humans. Think about this. We watch pornography on this thing. We objectify a person for our own personal gain and our own personal lusts. Yet we give these things names, like Siri and Alexa and all these other things we call it. Do you notice what we just did? We humanized an object we use to objectify humans. Now I think, here's where the church, I think, is going to have a problem. I think, one, we're going to have a look back, and the church will have been silent where it ought to have spoken up, and it will speak up where it ought to have been silent. How exactly, I don't know. And on what issues, I don't know. But there are plenty of things, there are plenty of causes to champion, and we're majoring on minors sometimes, and we're forgetting about the major issues that are plaguing us. And maybe, I pray this won't be the case, but Jesus talks about those who say, didn't I do this in your name, and didn't I do this in your name? And he says, get away from me, I never knew you, because you didn't really do them for the right reason. You did them to justify yourself, your own righteousness. So one of the things I think the church is in danger of is its own self-righteousness, and the more opposition it gets, the more entrenched in its own self-righteousness it tends to be. Now, I'm not saying that pressure from the outside world isn't coming, or is it here already? What I'm saying is our response to it. I think history will look back and say, what were we doing? Were we serving others, or were we serving ourselves? The pagan emperor Julian, talk about history. The pagan emperor Julian was writing to officials within his ambit, and he was noting something, that Christians were winning the hearts and minds of the populace, of the Romans, the pagan Romans. They were winning their hearts and minds for Christ. And he said the reason they're doing that is because these insipid Galileans, he called them, are caring not only for the poor, weak, and indigent in their own numbers, but they're caring for the poor, weak, and indigent amongst our numbers. They were loving their enemies. And it changed the Roman Empire forever. I worry that we're so entrenched in the culture war that we only see enemies, not those for whom Christ died. That's what I worry about. Thank you so much for your question, Beth.
Hi there, I'm
Hey.
Jacob. I don't have a question for you per se, but I have a friend who can make it here tonight who wanted to ask you something.
Okay.
So he wanted to know that when there are such awful people in the world, murderers, rapists, how do we forgive them? How do they deserve forgiveness?
How do they deserve forgiveness? That's a good question. It's a great question, actually. I like the way, now maybe he didn't word it exactly this way, but if he did, I think this is helpful as well. How do they deserve forgiveness? The answer is they don't. By definition, no one deserves it. Forgiveness is giving you something you don't deserve. So if they don't deserve it, no one deserves it. And if no one deserves it, then how do you give it? You give it freely. This is interesting, by the way. In every circumstance, and this is a harsh reality of life, in every circumstance where forgiveness is given, the forgiver always pays. Always. So if you've been slighted, if you've been betrayed, and someone is sorrowful, and they feel that sense of sorrow, they have that sense of sorrow, and they say, please forgive me. When you forgive, that slight didn't go away suddenly. That pain you experienced for those years doesn't suddenly go away. You still have to bear that in some sense. Now, you'll get over it over time, and forgiveness helps us to get over that. But the forgiver almost always pays, at least to some degree. But here's what they pay more for. If they remain in bitterness towards someone, they will pay far more. Because that justice they're looking for will never quite come. And if it does come and they're just bitter, they're not going to be left with a sense of satisfaction. They'll be left with that sense of bitterness. So forgiveness is not just something that we're supposed to do because we've been forgiven. And that's the other issue too. They are the ones who should be forgiven. What about us? How many times have we longed for forgiveness? How many times have we done something, whether major or minor, and hoped that we could be forgiven for that thing, whether it's by God or by the person we hurt, whatever it is. And so we extend forgiveness because we know, especially as a Christian, that you extend forgiveness because you have had much to be forgiven for. You know, that's why Jesus gives that parable when he says that the master had forgiven one person a small debt, and he forgave one person a huge debt. And the one who was forgiven the huge debt, he said, who would have loved more? He said, the one forgiven much loved more. It's a natural response. When you forgive someone of much sin, there's something that's good that happens to you. It's a benefit to you. But there's also someone else who is forgiven as well. Let me give you one last bit on this, okay, Jacob? I think this is important. Jacob, right? Okay, good, I got it right. You know, I was studying justice and forgiveness and thinking about this. And in English, you have two words that are related to each other. You have vindication. Vindication is a biblical concept, but it's also just a human concept where the victim is seen and the wrong is acknowledged and some kind of a recompense is done to make the victim whole, or at least as whole as you can. That's vindication. You know what's incredibly close to that in the root words? The word vindictive is very close to vindication. And when you are vindictive, you hurt someone else because they hurt you. That's not justice, that's revenge. And so the reason I bring this up is because the line between the words vindication, which is justice, and vindictive, which is revenge, is so close. The words are so similar, we can barely tell them apart, which means that we are ill-suited to determine if someone should be punished or forgiven, which is why God says, I'm the one who sees. Vengeance is mine, not yours. So I think that we have to be ever so careful between being vindictive and wanting to get vindication. We should constantly seek vindication, but with the role or the goal of seeing the perpetrator rehabilitated, the perpetrator redeemed. That doesn't mean there's no consequences to that person's terrible actions. We need that for justice to be real. But what we want is that person's redemption, because we want their good as well. Is that hard to do? Yes. So it's very hard to forgive someone who's hurt us so deeply or committed such a terrible crime. But it's very important for us to recognize that we're not here just for the punishment of people. We're here for their redemption as well. Thank you, Jacob. Is that it? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Would you close it out? Okay, sure. So guys, it's gone long, and some folks have had to leave, and I appreciate that. Let me suggest this to you all. If you, first of all, you've been so patient and so kind with your time, and indulging me as we come here and talk on these issues, these tough issues. What I want to suggest to you is if you don't know who Jesus actually is, let me offer something to you. One, there's people here in Crew and other places who want to talk with you further about these issues. I'm very happy to talk with you. You can connect with us in any way that you see up on the screen. We're happy to try to engage with you. But I would suggest this. If you don't know who Christ is, and you're thinking, maybe this has moved the needle at least to some degree. Maybe it hasn't, maybe it has. And if it has, what I want to suggest to you is go back, open up a Gospel of John in the Bible. Look at the Gospels, read the Gospel of John, and then ask yourself, and maybe do a prayer, maybe you've never prayed before in your life. You thought, well, if I'm just praying to the walls, I'm just thinking of the ceiling, that's fine, you'll get no answer back. But maybe you're not. And if you're not, ask, is this person I'm reading about in this Gospel of John, is he real? Is this who this Bible really says he is? And then read it again and see if maybe he's the one who beckons you to see that your rationality is not a delusion, and the dangers you see around us can be actually fixed by the one who come to fix you and me. I pray that happens for you. If you need to talk with us more, I'm very happy to stick around and answer some more questions and spend some time with you as well, but contact us again. I want to thank you all for your indulgence. Thank you so much for spending time with me. You've put up with me for quite some time, and at this point, I'll just say good night.
Abdu, thank you so much for that. So real quick before you guys go, I would like to invite you to look at the little white flyer and question card that is under your seats with the pencils. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to walk y'all through that really quick. Okay, so first of all, just fill out your name and your phone number. We're not going to spam you with stuff, so don't worry about that. And then after that, I'd like you in the check that all apply section, just check anything there that applies to you. Pretty self-explanatory. And then after that, just circle where you live. We have community groups and activities at different campuses. And so here, obviously at Florida Tech, we have just our crew club, but we do offer different community groups. So we do have a men's community group on Mondays, and then we also have a co-ed community group on Tuesdays, and then our general meetings are on Fridays in Crawford at 8 p.m. And then other than that, you just indicate if you are a grad student, international student, if you're in a frat or sorority, and then finally on the back, you just write any comments or questions that you guys might have for us about tonight. Okay, and then so when all of you guys are done filling that out, you can just fold them in half, and we'll have Eric, I think, coming around with a basket that you guys can drop those in. This way, they're not getting lost. Okay, and just some final reminders. If you scan the QR code, that one right there, thank you. That is the QR code to our Instagram, which is crew@FIT. So on our Instagram, you can see all of the events and activities that we're holding. So community groups, general meetings, as well as fun social events. So feel free to do that, and you'll find all of that information over there. And then other than that, there are resources here if you're looking to connect with Abdu. I think we had some stuff up previous to this slide that they'll put back up at the end so you guys can get connected and use those resources if needed. And Abdu is here to answer any of your questions if you want to come up after and talk to him. Other than that, I hope you guys have a beautiful night. Thank you guys so much for coming out, and we appreciate having you.